Welcome. Whatever you're doing these last days of summer, stop, take some time, and read this book. I promise you will laugh and cry, and by the last page, I think you'll be ready for the revolution. The title is This Town, and it's an up-close look at how our nation's capital really works. I can tell you, it's not a pretty picture. Here's just one example. 3 men on a summer's day in Mississippi. Why are they smiling? And what are they really up to? Yes, that's former President Bill Clinton on the right, and on the left, his best friend forever, Terry McAuliffe, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, fundraiser supreme for both Bill and Hillary, and the personification of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. Smack in the middle, that's Haley Barbour, former chairman of the Republican National Committee. He made a fortune lobbying for corporations, especially for the tobacco industry, then went home to serve 2 terms as governor of Mississippi and couldn't wait to get back to Washington, where once again he's gunslinging for the big boys. So why did these 3 D.C. desperados ride into a small Mississippi town? Seems that when Barbour was governor, he offered McAuliffe a very attractive state package of price and tax subsidies for a plant there to build electric cars for his green tech automotive company. McAuliffe also tapped his politically connected network for more than $100 million in capital with the help of Hillary Clinton's brother, Tony Rodham, whose company, Gulf Coast Funds Management, shares office space with Green Tech and raised money from overseas. They held this big shindig for Green Tech's grand opening last year, and that's where this picture was snapped of 3 very happy crony capitalists. Unfortunately, back in Virginia, where Green Tech is based and McAuliffe is running for governor, the company has produced very few jobs and is under investigation into whether McAuliffe and Tony Rodham made improper use of a federal program for foreign investors. Mark Leibovich was there in Horn Lake, Mississippi, covering the triumvirate of McAuliffe, Barbour, and Clinton as they charmed the locals. He's the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine and the author of This Town, which has everyone who's anyone in Washington talking. What a tale it is. Mark Leibovich is with me now. Welcome.
Hi, Bill. It's good to be here.
I've read your book twice. It's fun to read. It's eye-opening. I learned a lot from it. And yet, at the core of it, there's a tragic story. You see that?
Absolutely. I didn't see it fully as I was writing it, but I see it in how people outside of Washington have reacted to it. The tragic story is that what has grown up in this city that was supposedly built on public service is this permanent feudal class of insiders, of people who are not term limited, of people who never leave and never die, figuratively never die, and who are there and who are doing very, very well for themselves, very, very well for Washington, and not very, very well for the United States.
Can you frame the historical moment in which you're writing?
I would frame it really over the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years. You've had this explosion of money in politics.
Gold rush, you call it.
It's a gold rush. People now come to Washington to get rich. That was never the defining ethic of the town, certainly 30 years ago. There is now so much money. It is now the wealthiest community in the United States. It is home to 7 of the wealthiest 10 counties in the United States. And frankly, it is, I mean, power is obviously going to be very alluring. There's going to be some idealists. There's going to be the make a difference types. But ultimately, this has more in common with Silicon Valley, with Hollywood, than with Wall Street, which is a rush to cash in. It is a rush to somehow take from this big entity, this big marketplace, some kind of reward, as opposed to doing something that will reward the country.
What's stunning is how disconnected Washington is, the political Washington that you write about from the lives of everyday people. Is it because of this gold rush?
When you look at the disconnect between Washington and the rest of the country, which people talk about, I mean, there's a shorthand, well, Washington is out of touch, right? People don't fully know what that is made of. I mean, I think you see intuitively on TV or when you visit Washington that people don't talk and deal with people the way most Americans talk and deal with each other. I mean, there's a language of obsequiousness, a language of selling, a language of spin. But look, it is a wealth culture. These are people who are doing very, very well. It's true in the demographics. It's true in the sensibility.
The people you write about in here seem very comfortable with this town.
They do. I mean, it's been very, very good for them. I mean, look, this town has worked for a lot of people, a lot of very good people, a lot of very bad people, and a lot of very mediocre people. But a lot of this book is filled with profiles of people who have made this town work for them.
What do the readers out across the country tell you about the picture you have reported?
Well, the disconnect, it's interesting, Bill, has been very much displayed in the reaction to the book. I mean, I think in Washington you have had a very carnival-like reaction to the book. It's like, oh, who wins, who loses? What are the nuggets? Will Leibovich be cast out? Will he not be invited to lunch or to party X or Y again? So you have a very silly and shallow read inside the Beltway, which is titillating, I guess, in its own way. Outside of Washington, you have a truer sense of the outrage. You have a sense of an education. You have a sense of, oh my goodness, I've known Washington has been something I've been disappointed in, but I didn't know it looked like this. I didn't know it had come to all of this, just this incredible contempt for what they are supposed to be there for, contempt for what their constituents are, i.e. us.
You say political Washington is an inbred company town where party differences are easily subsumed by membership in the club, and you've talked about the club. The club swells for the night into the ultimate bubble world. They become part of a system that rewards, more than anything, self-perpetuation.
Self-perpetuation is a key point in all of this. It is what you are going to, how you're going to continue. I mean, the original notion of the founders is that a president or a public servant would serve a term, a couple years, return to their communities, return to their farm. Now, the organizing principle of life in Washington is how are you going to keep it going? Whether it's how you're going to stay in office, you know, by pleasing your leadership so that you get money, by raising enough money so that you can get reelected, by getting a gig after you're done with Congress, after you're done in the White House, by getting the next gig.
Mr. Smith goes to Washington, it ain't.
No, it isn't. It isn't. And look, I tried to find a Mr. Smith character. I wanted to, and I had some back and forth with the first publisher of this book, which is not the ultimate publisher of this book, about finding someone to root for. They wanted someone to feel good about, to sort of run through the narrative. And there are people I think I could root for. There are people I like in Washington. I think people who are there for the right reasons, but I couldn't find him or her. And ultimately I gave up trying, and I tried to sort of create a cumulative picture over a 5-year period.
What does that say to you?
I think ultimately it says that this is not, well, first of all, it's a very cautious culture. I mean, I think cowardice is rewarded at every step of the way.
How so?
It's rewarded in Congress. Everything about the congressional system, whether it's leadership, whether it's how money is raised, is going to reward cowardice. The true mavericks are going to be punished in some ways. If you want to build a career outside of office when you're done, when you're voted out, as a lobbyist, as a consultant, as many of them do, you are absolutely encouraged to not anger too many people.
Not take a big stand then.
Not take a big stand, right. No truth is going to be told here based on any sort of cowardly go along, get along way. And I think that there are many ways in which the system is financed, the politics are financed, the way the media works, that will not, under any circumstances, reward someone who takes a stand.
As you and I both know, many Americans see Washington today as a polarized, dysfunctional city, one that is not sufficiently bipartisan. But you describe it as a place that becomes a determinedly bipartisan team when there is money to be made.
It is absolutely true. I mean, ultimately, the business of Washington relies on things not getting done, and this is a bipartisan imperative. If a tax reform bill passed tomorrow, if an immigration bill passed tomorrow, that's tens of billions of dollars in consulting, lobbying, messaging fees that are not going to be paid out.
Let's take one example.
Yeah.
April 20th, 2010. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig explodes in the Gulf of Mexico. 11 people killed, the largest marine spill in the history of the industry. Oil gushes onto the seafloor for at least 84 days. You, Leibovich, look at that crude oil flowing into the Gulf, and you see an equally large flow of cash spreading across Washington, covering our nation's capital to, quote, as you say, manage the crisis. Now,
yes.
Tell us how they set about to manage that crisis.
So BP is in this whole heap of trouble, okay? They have this disaster that they are pegged with. The president looks powerless. I mean, what are you going to do? You have this awful calamity taking place. Systematically, BP is spending tens of millions of dollars to basically tie up the most prominent Washington Democratic and Republican lobbyists, media consultants, ad people, to where you had an all-star roster. And all of a sudden, everyone is working together. I mean, you had rhetoric of President Obama, criticizing BP. You had BP saying, oh, no, we're going to make this right. You had Republicans saying, oh, the president should be doing more. So you had this TV sort of debate, the same noise you would see any other story, juxtaposed with these terrible oil-soaked Pelican pictures from the Gulf, when in fact the city is just reaping this bounty.
You say BP, British Petroleum, put together a Beltway dream team that included Republican super lobbyist Ken Duberstein, Democratic super lobbyist Tony Podesta, former Vice President Cheney's one-time spokeswoman Ann Womack Colton, Republican flacks like John Fury, and Democratic flacks like Steve McMahon, and McMahon's business partner, the Republican media guru Alex Castellanos, who's a contributor to CNN.
Yeah, McMahon's on MSNBC, and so it's very bipartisan that way too.
And McMahon, the Democrat, and Castellanos, the Republican, are partners in a firm called Purple Strategy. BP hires them to spearhead this $50 million television campaign you talk about.
To those affected and your families, I'm deeply sorry.
They were brought, you say, into the fold by the Democratic operative Hillary Rosen, who was working for a London-based firm that was also working for BP, and she was also a pundit for CNN. I mean, what a web.
And again, I think the other piece of this is that a year later, Jeff Morrell, who was the head spokesman for the Pentagon under President Obama's Pentagon, has become the chief Washington spokesman for BP.
Former White House correspondent for ABC News.
ABC News.
This one-woman protest.
He followed Bob Gates to the Pentagon, first with President Bush, then with President Obama. Sort of a classic revolving door figure, Jeff is. But no, so that was, it's a classic two-step. I also think BP has done very, very well rehabilitating itself. Thanks largely to flooding the media with all kinds of goodies and a lot of advertising money, and we're supposed to feel good about BP again.
2 years ago, the people of BP made a commitment to the Gulf, and every day since, we've worked hard to keep it. BP has paid over $23 billion to help people and businesses who were affected and to cover cleanup costs. Today, the beaches and Gulf are open for everyone to enjoy, and many areas are reporting their best tourism seasons in years. We've shared what we've learned with governments and across the industry so we can all produce energy more safely.
And what's the moral that we draw from this story about this town?
About this town is, well, first of all, when there's a problem, there is a lot of money to be made in this town. And look, it's another example of Washington doing very, very, very well.
Let's look at Jack Quinn and Ed Gillespie.
Jack Quinn is the White House counsel under Bill Clinton. He went on to cable a lot and defended the president during a lot of his campaign finance problems during his 2 terms. Met Ed Gillespie, who was then a Republican operative, in green rooms. They had this green room friendship. People become friends, and in Ed and Jack's case, they went into business together. They started Quinn Gillespie, the first real major sort of bipartisan lobbying firm.
One-stop lobbying.
One-stop lobbying. You want to deal with Republicans, you want to get to Republicans, you go here. You want to get to Democrats, you go here. They founded their firms founded in 2000. Jack Quinn got into some trouble in 2001 after he successfully lobbied Bill Clinton to pardon his law client, Mark Rich. Fugitive, Mark Rich. It was a big to-do then. Jack was big time in the barrel. He's hauled before Congress. He feels like he's being looked at in restaurants. And Ed Gillespie said, look, Jack, in a few months, everyone's going to forget about this, and all they're going to remember about you and this incident is that you got something big done. And sure enough, Jack did a good job for his client. The outrage dissipated, and the lobbying firm thrived with the rest of the industry.
4 years later, they sold out for $40 million. Now, how do they make that much money in 4 years? And the talent they bring is that they're creatures of Washington.
That's a very, very, very valuable commodity. I mean, if you can sell yourself as someone who knows how Washington works, someone who has these relationships, someone who can get on the phone and get the President of the United States to pardon, your fugitive client, that's a very, very marketable commodity. I mean, if you are seen as someone who knows how this town works, someone who is a usual suspect in this town, you can dine out for years. That's why no one leaves.
You once asked the Democrat Jack Quinn what appealed to him about the Republican Ed Gillespie, who became his partner when they first started bonding, and he answered,
well, Ed got the joke.
What's the joke?
That's what I said. I said, Jack, what's the joke? And he said, the joke is that, well, we're all patriots. And I thought that was both, it was some mix of sarcasm, contempt, glibness, I don't know. It was a fascinating answer.
You report in here that over the last dozen years, corporate America, much of it Wall Street, has tripled the amount of money it spent on lobbying and public affairs in D.C. because, and I'm quoting you, they have figured out that despite the exorbitant cost of hiring lobbyists, the ability to shape or tweak or kill even the tiniest legislative loophole can be worth tens of millions of dollars.
First of all, there's extravagant waste in the private sector of Washington. If you go to some of these lobbying offices and parties and what they're billing people, I mean, it looks like an incredible racket. In fact, these companies are getting what they pay for. I mean, Tony Podesta, who we talked about before, a Democratic lobbyist, talked about how great it is that laws are so complicated now. I mean, the context was, I think it was Dodd-Frank, or it might have been in healthcare. There are these tiny little loopholes. They go on for thousands of pages. And if you can be a lobbyist or a lawyer in a firm who can understand this much, and you're getting paid, tens of millions of dollars, but you're probably saving your clients, hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes more. So it's very cost effective. I mean, the complete arcaneness of this world is, again, very, very good for business.
Let's quickly run through some of the roll call of influence peddlers that you write about. Billy Tauzin.
Billy Tauzin was a former Democrat, became a Republican congressman, went on to become the head of one of the top pharmaceutical lobbies in the country.
After, in the House, overseeing the drug industry, chairing the committee that oversaw the drug industry, and he was crucial in passing the Medicare prescription bill, which has meant billions in profits for the drug companies. Then he resigned, as you say, ran the pharmaceuticals lobbying arm in Washington, and in 2010, according to you, made $11.6 million. Steve Croft and 60 Minutes did an expose of him.
I mean, this doesn't look good.
But
you push this bill through that gets that produces a windfall for the drug companies, and then a short time later, you go to work for the drug lobby at a salary of $2 million.
There's nothing I could have done in my life after leaving Congress that I didn't have some impact on in 25 years in Congress. And if that looks bad to you, have at it. That's the truth.
In fairness to Billy Tauzin and former Medicare Chief Tom Scully, they weren't the only public officials involved with the prescription drug bill who later went to work for the pharmaceutical industry. Just before the vote, Tauzin cited the people who had been most helpful in getting it passed.
And I specifically want to thank the staffs of our committees. From Ways and Means, John McManus, who did such a great job.
Within a few months, McManus left Congress and started his own lobbying firm. Among his new clients were Pharma, Pfizer, Lilly, and Merck.
From the majority side of the Finance Committee, Linda Fishman.
Fishman left to become a lobbyist with the drug manufacturer Amgen.
Not the least of all, but the Energy and Commerce Committee staff who toil so hard for us. Chief of Staff Pat Morrissey.
Morrissey took a job lobbying for drug companies Novartis and Hoffman LaRoche.
And Jeremy Allen.
He went to Johnson & Johnson.
Kathleen Weldon and Jim Barnett.
She went to lobby for Biogen, a biotech company. He left to lobby for Hoffman LaRoche.
They did a marvelous job for this House, and we owe them a debt of thanks. Thank you all.
We owe them all right. Wow. Yeah, I mean, it happens with every bill. I mean, I think what was striking about that is Congressman Tozan actually sort of basically sent a resume out on all of their behalfs by sort of doing a roll call in his remarks. But look, I mean, the Steve Croft piece was stunning in that I think he caught Tozan just oddly flat-footed. I mean, I think, but it seemed, sort of, in reading his face, he seemed almost flat-footed that the question would be asked. I mean, no one is really going to burn any bridges. I mean, it's like one big bridge in some ways. And look, I mean, Jack Abramoff is a name that actually has not come up here. I mean, he is the picture of modern disgrace in Washington, right? The disgraced lobbyist. One of the many books I read in preparing this book was his memoir, which he wrote, I think, largely, I don't know if he wrote it in prison, but I think a lot of it was probably derived from his ruminations in prison. He told about how he knew as a lobbyist, he would have these relationships with people on the Hill, people in the White House, people, elected officials, and at a certain point they would say, hey, you know what, Congressman X, or you know what, Staffer X, you're really good at this. When you're done, have you thought about what you're going to do when you leave the Hill? And they'd say, well, not really. Or they would just sort of leave the question open. And Jack Abramoff said, I knew that when I could ask that question, I owned him. Because there's a preemptive bribe there. It's, you know, you're going to be making maybe $1 million at my lobbying firm if you answer this question correctly and you act correctly, I mean, in your office, if you can help us, if you can maintain this friendship for as long as you are in power. I mean, when you see Peter Orszag going to Citigroup, when you see Jake Siewert going to Goldman, when you see Jeff Morrell going to BP, it does sort of beg the question, who were they working for when they were at the Pentagon, at the OMB, at the Treasury Department? I mean, you just sort of wonder where their mind is.
Trent Lott, you say he's the archetype of the age of the former.
Right.
What's a former?
A former is a former office holder, a former senator, a former congressman, a former White House deputy chief of staff or whatever. I mean, the line I have in the book is that formers stick to Washington like melted cheese on a gold-plated toaster. They don't go home anymore. They talk about how much they hate Washington, but they settle in here quite comfortably. And Trent Lott was the Senate Majority Leader, you know, very powerful Republican. He kind of abruptly retired in 2007, I think, went into business with John Breaux, a Democratic senator. He was a longtime senator from Louisiana. As a member of Congress, Breaux said, someone called him a cheap whore, and he said, I'm not that cheap. And he also said, my vote cannot be bought, it can be rented.
So you've got the Republican lot and the Democratic Breaux.
It's another
creating a boutique lobbying firm.
Yeah, although they eventually were absorbed into Patton Boggs, which is, you know, one of the bigger lobbying firms in town.
Tommy Boggs, son of the former Democratic Majority Leader Hale Boggs, who's arguably the most powerful lobbyist firm in Washington.
Has been for many years. But anyway, so Trent Lott and John Breaux have been very, very successful in the last 5-6 years as lobbyists. Trent Lott, a pretty candid guy. I mean, he talked about how much he hates Washington. I said, so why do you stay? And he looked at me like I was crazy, and he said, well, because this is where all the problems are, but this is where all the money is. I mean, this is what keeps people here, and it's true. No one leaves anymore.
Richard Gephardt.
Richard Gephardt, former House Majority Leader, two-time presidential candidate, a hero to organized labor.
Son of a Teamster.
Son of a Teamster, milk truck driver. Gave some of the most impassioned campaign rallies I've ever seen in places like Iowa and
for working people.
For working people. I mean, he seemed like the real deal. He became a lobbyist, like a lot of members of Congress do, and he's since has worked for a lot of corporations.
Goldman Sachs, Boeing, Visa, I get from your book.
Yeah, many of them not terribly friendly to organized labor.
In Congress, as you say, he fought for labor, but then he went to work for Spirit Aerosystems, overseeing a tough anti-union campaign. And then in the House, he had supported a resolution condemning the Armenian genocide of 1915. When he left Congress, he was paid about $70,000 a month by the Turkish government to oppose the resolution.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the word genocide goes down a little easier at those rates, right? I mean, it's, look, I mean, I don't see any shame there. I don't, again, he's allowed to change his mind for money. I'm allowed to be outraged.
Evan Bayh, Democrat from Indiana.
Yeah, Evan Bayh was this two-term senator. He retired very, very extravagantly in the pages of the New York Times about how Washington is broken, how he was tired of all the yelling matches and partisanship and how nothing gets done, and he wanted to get into an honorable line of work. And a lot of his colleagues were not happy with this description, but also were rolling his eyes because they were like, where was that outrage when you were in office? And one of his colleagues said, well, that's the most effective speech he's given, in 8 years here, or in 12 years here. He immediately joined Fox News. He joined the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, this is someone who was a runner-up to be President Obama's running mate. He and Andy Card, the White House Chief of Staff under President Bush, they sort of did a dog and pony act in which they would go out in the country on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce.
Which is the biggest business lobby
lobby in Washington. Absolutely. A big thorn in the side of this White House. And have, been giving a lot of speeches sort of in support of that agenda.
In your book, you quote one journalist calling Bayh the perfectly representative face for the rotted Washington establishment. Another of your colleagues said he was acting to entrench the culture of narcissism and hypocrisy that's killing the United States Congress. Another describes him practically a caricature of what a sellout looks like. I would take from your book that you don't think those depictions are too harsh.
No, not at all. I think it's true. Look, I mean, I just sort of lay out the examples. I lay out his words. I mean, he was so sanctimonious in his departure.
Can we not remember that we are one nation under God, with a common heritage and a common destiny? Let us no longer be divided into red states and blue states, but reunite once more as 50 red, white, and blue states. As the civil rights leader once reminded us, we may have arrived on these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. So, my friends, the time has come for the sons and daughters of Lincoln and the heirs of Jefferson and Jackson to no longer wage war upon each other, but instead to renew the struggles against the ancient enemies of man: ignorance, poverty, and disease. That is why we're here. That is why.
He was so disgusted with Washington, and of course he stayed, and there are all these examples of what he has gone on to do. So, look, it all speaks for itself. I mean, you can. It's nice that there are commentators who can put a finer point on it, but this is all out there.
Chris Dodd, former Peace Corps volunteer.
Chris Dodd, very nice guy, very fun, loving guy. I mean, very sort of outspoken liberal. He had this great legislative last hurrah in 2010, where he co-authored Dodd-Frank. He was one of the chief engineers of the health care bill. I remember talking to him when he announced he wasn't going to run. He got into some trouble. He was very, very unpopular, and back in Connecticut, he got in some trouble with a mortgage broker.
He took a loan, I think, from Countrywide, which was a force in the housing bubble.
Right, at a time when he was, presumably, was chairman of the banking committee, could have been very involved in that, but also was running for president in a fairly quixotic.
With a lot of money from Wall Street.
A lot of money from Wall Street, and he basically decamped to Iowa for a few months in 2008. Chris Dodd, I remember having lunch with him in the Senate dining room and saying, "So, what are you going to do now?" And it was a triumphant moment, and because these bills were actually going to pass, and he said, "Oh boy, the possibilities are endless. I mean, I could be a college president. I might go out to work for some startup. I might rejoin the Peace Corps." I mean, he had this look of possibility, and I said, "You're not going to lobby, right?" And he said, "Oh no. I'll take that off the table right now." And he is now head of one of the most powerful lobbies in town, the Motion Pictures Association of America. He would say that, well, I'm not registered to lobby technically, and it's true, but he also oversees a staff of lobbyists. And this chapter about that is, I talk about just the institutionalization of being part of the political class. I mean,
do you think he lied to you?
He would say that his thinking evolved. I don't think I don't know. What do you call it? It turned out not to be true. I mean, look, it's disappointing. I mean, I just say that as someone who is looking for someone to level with him.
You say the official language in Washington is fraudulent language. It's the language of spin, marketing, PR.
It's not how human beings talk to each other. And people don't You become very anesthetized. I mean, Washington is a huge, huge dome of anesthesia. People don't fully know just, again, the BS that is just part of the day-to-day transaction. And again, it's hard to realize when you're living there. I mean, I think Bob Bennett, the senator from Utah, he was voted out. Well, Mike Lee primaried him.
Tea Party.
Tea Party guy. Someone said, so you're going to cash in? He goes, I'm entitled to make a living. And that's, look, it's what they do.
Even my friend Byron Dorgan, the former Democratic senator from North Dakota, was once a source of mine. Despite all the populist sentiment he expressed over the years, you point out that on the same day Robert Bennett made his announcement, Byron Dorgan made his announcement, they would be joining together one of the big law firms that includes a large lobbying component. And you point out that both had served on the Senate Committee on Appropriations. Now, what advantage did that give them?
Appropriations committees gives you a huge advantage because that's money, essentially. It's where money is spent. It's where it's allocated.
Where the cash goes.
Where the cash goes. So that is the most, by far, the most coveted sort of lobbying targets when you have either a congressman or a Senate who is retiring from one of these committees or voted out.
You write about Anita Dunn. Tell me about Anita Dunn.
Anita Dunn is a longtime Democratic operative. She was one of the top aides for President Obama's 2008 campaign. She was a communications director for a time in the White House. Very, very sharp woman. She was very, very instrumental in sort of helping the First Lady, for instance, sort of pass or put together her anti-obesity initiative. She's now one of the top media consultants in town. And she's done a lot of work to, I mean, some would say maybe undo some of the work she did in the White House.
As you say, Anita Dunn helped Michelle Obama set up her Let's Move program to stop obesity. I'm almost quoting you verbatim.
Yep, sure.
Then she signs on as a consultant to the food manufacturing and media firms trying to block restrictions on sugary foods targeting children. Her husband, by the way, and this is coincidental, I'm sure, happened to be the president's White House counsel.
Certainly Anita Dunn has benefited greatly from the perception of her being still a figure with ties to the White House, whether it's her husband, who's now the former White House counsel, but someone who has all kinds of friends there, who's on the phone there all the time. I mean, that has to be a boon to her corporate clients.
You talked about President Obama and his campaign and his opposition to the revolving door. Let me play you an excerpt from one of his speeches.
But the American people deserve more than simply an assurance that those who are coming to Washington will serve their interests. They also deserve to know that there are rules on the books to keep it that way. They deserve a government that is truly of, by, and for the people. As I often said during the campaign, we need to make the White House the people's house. And we need to close the revolving door that lets lobbyists come into government freely and lets them use their time in public service as a way to promote their own interests over the interests of the American people when they leave.
And what happened?
They have put this law in place. We won't have lobbyists in the White House. They kept making exceptions. There have been a number of people who they have waived that rule for. But ultimately, I think what's happened is more on the other end. You've had people leaving the White House to go right to K Street. You've had people leaving the White House going right to Goldman Sachs, going right to BP, going right to Citigroup. I mean, some of the biggest corporate nemesis of this administration in the first term are now being staffed at the highest levels by people who were staffing the Obama administration. At the
Peter Orszag, who was Obama's head
OMB director, Office of Management and Budget director.
Now at Citi.
High level at Citi. Jake Seward, who was a chief counselor to Tim Geithner as Secretary of Treasury. They were doing all kinds of battle with Goldman Sachs during the first term, especially after the financial crisis. Jake is now the head of communications for Goldman Sachs. I mean,
and so many of them have a connection to someone else who figures prominent in your book, Robert Rubin, Clinton's Treasury Secretary.
I mean, there's always been a symbiosis between Wall Street and Washington to some degree, but I think the Clinton era introduced a whole new level of magnitude to this, and Bob Rubin, who was the sort of storied head of Goldman Sachs for many, many years, coming to take the reins at Treasury, was really, I mean, he was a real guru, and he brought a lot of proteges, Larry Summers being the biggest example to town, Tim Geithner being another one. And yeah, and then the economy crashes, the banks crash. I mean, Robert Rubin gets a great deal of blame. I mean, Bill Clinton himself did a mea culpa on Robert Rubin
On ABC News.
on ABC News on George Stephanopoulos.
Rubin had been a force in killing Glass-Steagall, which was the firewall between commercial banks and investment banks. And he was a big supporter of derivatives, deregulation.
Absolutely.
And all that contributed to the fiscal crisis. After he left the Treasury Department, he went to Citi.
Went back to Citi.
You say he made $126 million in 9 years?
He did. No, he did very, very, very well.
You call Rubin the primest of movers in the modern marriage of politics and wealth creation.
Absolutely. He was the ambassador to the Clinton wealth machine. I mean, you had people like Rahm Emanuel, who was a mid-level White House operative in the Clinton White House, who was able to go to Wasserstein Perella and make 16.2 or 16 point something million.
$18 million in 2.5 years.
And then before he went back to become a public servant again and run for Congress. But no, Bob Rubin brought this whole generation of Wall Street people to Washington. Then he brought them back from Washington to Wall Street, greatly enriched. And look, he's a hero to a lot of people on Wall Street. He was a hero to a lot of people in Washington. And again, I think Bill Clinton, more than anyone in the last few decades, has sort of engineered this relationship.
Let's get to the press. You write, never before has the so-called permanent establishment of Washington included so many people in the media. And you write, Washington puts the me in media. How so?
Look, I mean, first of all, just the rise in new media has given everyone a voice. I mean, the rise of cable has given everyone a face. I mean, it has never been easier to become a media celebrity. And I think punditry has replaced reporting as the gold standard of my profession. I mean, the media is everywhere in Washington. I mean, I think the White House Correspondents' Dinner is a classic example of how Washington, rewards being famous, being on TV, being a brand more than anything.
Your descriptions of the White House Correspondents Association dinner, the annual dinner, are fabulous in the book. The dinner's sold out every table since 1993 at $2,500 a pop.
Yeah, but I mean, even the greater outrage is that it now goes over 5 days. You have probably about 24 pre-parties and after-parties. You probably have tens of millions of dollars, some funded by corporations, in entertainment, in sort of people sucking up to everyone else, and food and musical acts and so forth. Because, of course, a single banquet is no longer sufficient to celebrate the accomplishments of the Washington media. Tom Brokaw, who has become a real activist against the White House Correspondents' Dinner, said that it sends the message that it's all about the people on the screen. It's all about the media, which I think to some degree is true. I mean, the media is feeling great about itself. The media is as rich as any other part of the economy. And I think the Correspondents' Dinner is a classic example of this.
Have you attended one?
I have, although not since 1996, because the New York Times stopped letting us go.
Why?
They thought it was too. Dean Baquet, who's now the managing editor of the Times, he was the Washington bureau chief of the Times. I think it was in 2007, actually, declared that this was too cozy. He didn't like the message it sent. He would prefer that we stop going. I thought it was a great decision.
Describe the dinner to me.
It's just this room full of tuxedoed people. A lot of Hollywood celebrities come in. A lot of people talk about the good that the press does. But again, it's an extravaganza that continues, that it becomes the ultimate bubble world, the ultimate example of decadence in Washington that people know intuitively is wrong, but have no either will or ability to stop.
This is a big night in Washington. Anyone who's anybody is here, and the key question for anyone in Washington is, what are you wearing?
So you've got the politicians, the journalists, and plenty of celebrities thrown in between. I had a Katy Perry sighting, saw Bradley Cooper too.
Is there anyone you're excited to meet tonight?
Everyone, actually. I just came in with my buddy Chris Tucker. It was good to see him.
We understand that you know Michael Steele?
Michael Steele?
Yeah.
Do I?
Do you?
Who is Michael Steele?
And who are you wearing tonight?
Badgley Mishka.
So you're asking people what they're wearing and all that?
What are you wearing? Like today, any political conversations you're going to have at all?
Sure, we're having one right now, aren't we?
Is this still not the craziest thing ever?
Well,
when did this get to be like this?
Thank you, everybody. How do you like my new entrance music?
The problem is excess to some degree, it is perfectly emblematic of the reality distortion field inside of Washington, of just having no sense whatsoever, one, that the rest of the country is struggling, that the government is in financially very, very bad shape, that Washington is not doing a good job, and that this goes on year after year after year. Hollywood comes to town, you have the collision of the bubble worlds, right? And what I think is sort of striking is this year, Kevin Spacey, who's the star of House of Cards, which is not a very flattering picture of Washington, and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who is the star of Veep, which is this very, very funny HBO show. About the vice presidency, neither of which paint Washington in a flattering light. They both showed up to the dinner. They went to the big after party sponsored by Vanity Fair and Bloomberg, and they were both swarmed. Everyone was like, oh, we have to get our picture taken with Kevin Spacey and with Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who, I mean, ultimately paint a hideous portrait of how Washington works, and Washington at its most grotesque and perverse, and yet that's what we're celebrating. And again, you do sort of pinch yourself after a while and say, what are we celebrating here?
Yeah, there's a sequence in Netflix's House of Cards where some of Washington's best-known journalists are playing themselves in a fantasy world.
Just before we came on the air, I received an advance copy of an article that's going to be in tomorrow's Washington Herald's front page, and it was written by Zoe Barnes. And in it, she quotes an editorial that ran in the Williams College Register when you were editor back in September 1978, which called the Israeli presence in the Gaza Strip and West Bank, quote, an illegal occupation.
Quoting a source close to the president as saying that Senator Catherine Durant will likely be the new nominee for Secretary of State after Michael Curran's withdrawal.
Congressman Frank Underwood says he got, quote, schooled by AFT spokesman and chief strategist Martin Spinella during a debate last night on this network. In the past 24 hours, reruns of the gaffe have played nonstop on TV news programs and the internet.
Does it say something to you that prominent journalists are willing to erase the line between reality and fiction?
If you look at something like House of Cards, if you look at something like the Correspondents' Dinner, where you have Hollywood and Washington merging, and you have kind of a joined mind, a joined fame machine, you realize that the lines might not be that drawn to begin with, in any mind. I mean, I think one of the things, there's a scene at the end of this book in which a member of the campaign team from 2012 for President Obama said, after a while, it just seemed like everyone was thinking about who was going to play them in the next version of Game Change.
This is Sarah.
Which is this campaign book that was written by Mark Halperin and John Heilemann about the 2008 campaign, bestseller. And again, that sort of goes to the larger cinematic sense that people have of themselves here. There's a sense of preening, a sense of who's going to play me in the movie? Will I get a cameo playing myself in the movie, as people in the Game Change movie did? That's another scene in here. And again, it's a sort of blaming, it's the sort of blurring of the larger class of fame, of really the ruling class in the public perception game, that I think is as much a part of this decadence as really anything else.
As I read this book, I felt you were troubled by writing it. I mean, it's a fun book to read, as I said in the beginning, but there's something troubling you, even now, about this story.
I'm more troubled now after seeing people react to it. I mean, in two ways. One, seeing the very legitimate and frankly very gratifying outrage that it has wrought outside of town, because it gives me a level of, gives me a degree of faith that people can still be outraged, even when they're being amused or entertained or being hit with nuggets or whatever it is that people look for. In Washington, I've been outraged again, like I've said, by the complete lack of discussion it seems to have begot. The complete lame pushback, the complete how dare he of this, sort of trying to make me an outcast, that someone who has spoken out of school and someone who has tried to expose, I don't want to say I would try to expose the racket, because that makes me seem more muckraky than I probably am, but I think ultimately it's I think getting out of my writer's head and getting this book out into the marketplace and seeing people experience it has helped me to see the whole of it.
I was surprised when I read the book because I have followed your reporting, and you were reporting good stories, anecdotal stories and fact-driven stories, but they didn't seem to have the narrative's arc that emerges in this. Was that something you came to in the course of writing it or in the course of reporting? How did that come about?
It became a moment, and it did occur to me in being exposed to this that the political class that I'm writing about has reached some kind of critical mass in the 21st century. I think there's something going on in Washington that needed to be called out.
But the moment you talk about it.
The moment I talk about it, again, I don't think it can be sustained, and I think it's indecent. I think it is not how Americans want their government in their capital city to be. I think in some ways, and I always sort of cower under this claim when people ask me for prescriptions, but I think in some ways, I mean, I'm holding a mirror to a culture. It is a culture that people only know around the edges. I wanted to take it sort of full on in all its components, including the media, and hope to paint a picture that will stand as something that is lasting for this era.
Is it conceivable to you that 1, 2, 3, or 4 more people in your book might say, wait a minute, this is shameful, and they can't change it out there because we are impenetrable, so I'm going to stand up and we're going to change it from within?
Look, I mean, there are a lot of good people in Washington. I mean, it sounds contradictory given a lot of what we talked about, but there are people who, a lot of people who, especially when they're young or when they were young, they came from a place of decency. They came from a place of hope. And that doesn't completely go away, right? So, look, I wrote a book, and I'm speaking as a journalist, that I think in probably some level was a product of disgust, my own disgust. Maybe even there was a level of unconscious desire to check myself before finding myself too deep in the club, too much a part of this world. And I mean, so look, I mean, I absolutely would love this book to be a source of shame, of self-reflection, but I think I'm willing to start with discomfort. If this is a source of discomfort, I'm very happy with that too.
Suppose this culture in Washington is more representative of the country today than you want to acknowledge. So, you know, there's a scene in David Simon's series, The Wire, where a policeman is asking one of the kids on the street, why do you go on playing this game of poker when the guy you keep inviting to the game is stealing your money?
It's not Boogie always stole the money. Why'd you let him play? Got to. This America, man.
Because that's the American way. What if Washington has become the Wall Street way, the Las Vegas way, the Silicon Valley way?
It's a classic chicken-egg question. What we have now in the population is a level of dissonance, right? It's a level of disgust that is parallel to, maybe some indifference, but that is also parallel to your own role in re-electing your congressman, your own role in watching these shouting matches on cable, your own role in perpetuating this system, in being transfixed by these ads. So, yes, I mean, I think that this dissonance is something that lives in a very, very distilled way inside our nation's capital. And I think it's acted out by these real-life players who are, in a very writ large way, experiencing both the American dream and the American nightmare. And that is something that I think makes this town, but also the nation's capital at this moment, a very, very palpable place to watch this disconnect play out. And again, it's a lot to get your head around. I do think it is worth a discussion, and frankly, a smarter discussion than many people in Washington are willing to have.
This town is the place to begin. Mark Leibovich, thank you very much for the book, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Bill.